Good evening, everyone. Um, we'll start the evening. Is there place for everyone? And just a request to switch your phones off. So we start the evening, and may I ask Professor Naman P. Ahuja to start it for us? An applause for him.
Very nice to be here. Thank you all very much for coming. Good evening. Our plan for this evening is, wait, before we do that, you need chairs. There's a chair here in front. If somebody wants one, there's one here. And yeah, there's some chairs coming. There's some more chairs coming. So we'll be able to accommodate you. It's a great problem to have. Thank you all very much for being here. Lovely. So our plan for this evening is that I'll speak for a little while to introduce this latest issue of Marg, and then hand over to James McHugh, who is the guest editor and who's put this volume together. After that, we'll hand over to Projit. Projit Mukharji will speak for a little while, followed by Malayka. And then we'll have a Q&A and a little panel discussion. And feel free to ask us whatever. We'll try and address some of your queries. This Marg has been a real pleasure to put together. It's not every day that one gets to think about issues like this, about the histories of perfume. And how does one use words and ink and the printed page to be able to communicate something which is truly sensed? And I'm going to come back to that theme time and again in today's presentation. We begin this Marg, and I'd like to just dissect the cover for you. The cover is derived from a painting which comes from Mancourt, made between 1700 to 1720. It shows a Raja that we haven't been able to identify yet. But his painting and his jama and the lotus that he carries in his hand conjures a certain layering of fragrances. There's a top note of saffron crocuses painted on the outer gray jama, underneath which is a body which is covered in irises, while he proffers a top note right in the front of a half-blooming bud of lotus. It required some thinking, and I think it will require some thinking on the part of everyone to be able to use their imaginations as they look at this volume, to be able to not just read what the words have to say, but to be able to read what the pictures are trying to say about perfume as you look through this volume. So please do try and do that, because I can spell it out with regards to the cover, but I don't think we can do it with every image that's been selected in this volume. As you open this issue of Marg, you will come across our thematic portfolio. We always have a thematic portfolio in the opening 8 to 10 pages of every Marg. This is a kind of a storyboard of pictures, and pictures that communicate the main dilemmas, the issues that we wish to communicate. They become the springboard for the narrative that we will then be able to explicate in the essays that follow. In this one, we begin with capturing each element that makes up the fragrances we love, or fragrances that we use to heal, or to arouse, or calm. This can be quite tricky. Fragrance, after all, is communicated through many things, and perfume is only one of the things that is used to communicate fragrance. Some need capturing in smoke. That's the fume part of the word perfume. Others need to be captured in oil, yet others in alcohol, or some in resin. For some fragrances, we hunt for the anal glands of animals. For others, we gather shells from the ocean. The knowledge captured in the processing of each element, which makes a blend of perfume, forms an enormous cultural legacy that has been an arena of gross neglect in the histories of India. This issue of Marg is designed to open windows to them through a variety of approaches rooted in Indology, material culture, ethnography, medical and natural history, as well as in economic history. An array of scholars have come together to work on this volume under the stewardship of James McHugh. Several of the writers have been known to us at Marg for years. Emma Flatt, for instance, has written a new study for this Marg, building on her previous publications on the Sultanate period sources available to construct a history of perfumes by focusing, this time, on Deccani texts. And it's rather remarkable because it's not just dealing with fragrance, but also with the medical application of fragrances and how they are used. And so you have wonderful old paintings of the human anatomy and how it was meant to be, how fragrances affect the body. So as I was saying, James has brought together not just scholars that we have already known, but new voices and younger scholars for this volume. Nicholas Roth, who's written these articles, works at Harvard and finished his PhD recently in 2020. His research focuses on the history of horticulture and its reflections in literature and the visual arts. This permitted him to reflect on two essentially Indian flowers in this volume, the gulab and the champa, both fragrances of ancient ancestry. One that enraptured the West, and the other that captivated the trade with the East. Fresh flowers actually make their own demands on us. Some flowers exude their magic at night. How do you capture that perfume? Some in the day. Some need to be inhaled in special garlands or knotted carefully in a way that will preserve each variety's fragrance differently. So you don't just go around piercing buds as you knot them. There are special ways of knotting flowers, of different varieties of flowers, in order to be able to preserve their fragrance. And that becomes appropriate for different deities in temples. So temple shops and temple vendors know how to knot different flowers differently. And we have Ahalya Mathan, who has documented this and made very systematic illustrations of the main types of garlanding techniques that are used in order to be able to preserve those flowers. Ahalya Mathan is a perfumer. She's a blender, interpreting scents for brands, but also making bespoke perfumes for individuals, and is based in Bangalore. How perfumes have been packaged is another important question. What they have advertised, or how they have been advertised, makes for a fascinating history of what we have sought to purchase, what desires we have sought to fulfill, what pictures have we associated with those fragrances. This can indeed leave us thinking about our cultural conditioning. History apart, we also have to confront the question that Indian perfumes have a very rich historiography. It's not just a subject that we've discovered, and we're not opening up this subject for the first time. Projit Bihari Mukharji, who will be speaking to you shortly, is the head of the Department of History at Ashoka University. This year, he is also a Guggenheim Fellow. Projit specializes in the history of science, and his most recent monograph is titled Brown Skins, White Coats, Race Science in India. He is also an enthusiastic collector of various everyday ephemera, and it's from his collections that we've been able to draw many of the images that come in the portfolio in the opening pages of Marg. The shape and the nature of the bottles, The stickers and advertisements used to promote the fragrances and oils all went in feeding a certain image of India and an image of Indians in the West. But returning to our key question, on what actual historical sources might the histories of perfume be constructed? This volume presents us with a small sampling of texts that can be used for a history of perfumes, texts in Sanskrit, Farsi, or Tamil, for instance. Each requires a very different type of disciplinary training. Visual culture or art historical sources, ethnography, oral histories require their own specializations. Reading texts can be difficult. Things called by one name by someone somewhere need not be what the same word implies in another place or time. Even in the modern Greek and Latin-based world of taxonomy of plants, the scholarly effort at clarifying the chaos in systems of nomenclature has been going on for hundreds of years. We must remain cautious about the many shifts that took place as these words slipped and altered as plants were traded across land and sea. Vetiver, for instance, is a Tamil word, now widely used across European languages. But there is no concord on whether Gandharaj is actually a variety of lemon or is Gandharaj a variety of gardenia. The common words itr and atar, Persian and Arabic, have a range of words in Sanskrit, some of which are presented as a collage that opens this volume of Marg. James has very kindly helped in putting this together, these words and meanings. James is a Sanskritist who has been gathering references on these subjects for a couple of decades now, alongside ethnographies and oral histories. It's been a privilege to have had the opportunity to discuss and shape this volume with him. James McHugh studies the history and religions of early India. He completed his PhD at Harvard in 2008 and is now professor at the University of Southern California. His first book, I don't know how many of you have seen it, is a masterpiece, Sandalwood and Carrion, Smell in Indian Religion and Culture, came out in 2012. It explored the meanings behind odors, perfumes, and aromatics in India. And his latest book is far too racy and exciting. I've only received a copy of it last night. It's called An Unholy Brew, Alcohol in Indian History and Religion. This book is a study of alcohol, drinking, and abstinence in pre-modern South Asia. The questions he asks are relevant, and his command over varied sources has been truly gratifying for me to be able to engage with. Thank you very much, James. I've enjoyed working on this book with you. What kind of histories do the histories of fragrances intersect with? And what other kinds of studies do such histories enable? That of sexual allure, of course. And here it immediately begs us to ask the next question as to how perceptions of gender roles can alter in time and place. Aditya Harchand is a PhD student in the Department of South Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. Working primarily on Tamil language and literature, his research interests lie at the nexus of literary history, religious studies, and the study of material and sensory culture. And his article allows us to look at that. I've also tried to pair it with sculptures, which many of you who live in Delhi or in Jaipur or in Chennai may have seen. Sculptures of laboring bodies made with a mixture of frankincense and other fragrant substances mixed in with dung to be able to make these perfect portraits of the very laborers whose bodies it is that we are looking at. Studying not just perfume, but moving to the next question, But who makes perfume? What castes are permitted to work with these processes? A doctor, a chemist, a barber, a fisherman, a hunter, a farmer? Amanda Lanzillo is a lecturer in South Asian history at Brunel University in London. Her first book, Pious Labour, Islam, Artisanship and Technology in Colonial India. Kya hua? Her first book, Pious Labour, Islam, Artisanship and Technology in Colonial India, which has just come out, asks how Muslim artisans engaged with their trades and community histories under colonial authority. Perfume, therefore, allows us to open up histories of labor as well. The lengths to which people went to gather and distill the elements of a perfume, the history of its trade and retail, the economies that perfume has supported, are known to us from ancient Greek sources, Latin sources, as much as they are actually known to us from ancient Indian sources as well. But economics apart, the reader will find here studies that show how the distilling of fragrant substances is inseparable from medical and culinary histories. Their enormous variety in India, however, makes one wonder whether the Indian exposure to such a rich array of condiments in our food and in everyday life, our flowers and spices, does it produce a civilization that is particularly demanding of its olfactory senses? Do we have greater expectations of fragrance than others in the way we live our lives? Because everything seems to be connected with fragrance. Every fragrance can be received differently. It can mean different things depending on a variety of factors. The smell of someone's sweat is attractive to one person, but can be quite abhorrent to another. A fragrance may be attractive at one point in one's life, but not at another. Does a perfume project a longing for someone we wish to be, or does it trigger a memory of the person we once were? This allows us to raise the next set of questions about how histories of perfume can be used to write about our subjectivities. What is the cultural conditioning that guides human behavior and even civilizational preference? These are the sorts of questions that undergird the writing and practice of Shireen Hamza, who is a historian of science and medicine in the medieval Islamic world. She's also an artist working in movement, sound, and video. And it's her insight, very subjectively, that comes through in her writing, Therapeutic Tastes and Salubrious Smells. Writing and gathering the sources needed for histories of the so-called intangible aspects of heritage pose challenges. How does one conjure a cultural experience, especially that of aroma, in writing through photographs or writing through a printed page? The lingering smell of a favorite dish being cooked in the family kitchen or traces of a lover on one's skin might be a cliche, yet their psychological claim can only be understood through experiencing it. Right? The cliche can only make sense to you in poetry if you've actually, at some point, been through it. Neha Varmani is a British Academy Newton International Fellow at the Department of History in the University of Sheffield. She specializes in Mughal history. Her work explores the intersection between early modern South Asian material culture and the history of science, with a particular focus on the questions of food practices, body, and the affective register of food, dining. And so we've got Mughal tablecloths, and we've got Mughal dishes. And we've got a hookah to be able to wind your meal up with, to look at over here, to imagine what that whole meal might have been like. So what were the fragrances that were being conjured there? Marg has always tried to give space to photographs to ensure that the visual and the written narrative are equally strong. The restoration of the magazine to its original dimensions is a step in that direction, where the printed image cannot be substituted for what you can see on your little iPhone or what you can see on a laptop. The PDF isn't good enough. And that's kind of important for us as we look at these objects and we study the meaning behind these objects. However, this move towards print and returning to print was emboldened by another more important lesson that was learned during the pandemic, which was the necessity for culture to be communicated through a certain immersiveness, sina basina, as we call it, an aura that is personally sensed through music or the voice that is heard without the mediation of electronic amplification, or through the experience of holding a book again during the enormous push to turn all scholarship digital. This brought home the indispensability of the physical printed page, and this Marg has really attempted to do that, to bring something else to our readers. Our team has been challenged with the task of mixing the fabled smell of Indian mitti, or earth, and khas, or vetiver, which has been blended into the ink of one page in the Marg that you will get. The fragrance doesn't last, but we hope it will conjure at least an initial surprise when you open the book. Indian earth and grass seem simple enough, even democratic enough materials with which to make a point that access to fragrance and perfume is not the preserve of the elite. And yet, as we all know, it is access to certain perfumes that is used as a marker of class and privilege. And further, what each person dons to distinguish themselves from somebody else. So this is where the perfume volume lies, really. I'm particularly grateful to the art and design of Alexander Golitsky, whose work undergirds the opening pages of this particular issue of Marg. Brooklyn-based Golitsky is a contemporary artist who works with Riazuddin and his atelier Pink City Studio in Jaipur. Their work is featured on the sponsors page of the volume, and it serves as a background to the storyboards all through the first 10 pages of the Marg. It also formed the base of that page with the lotus, with all the words and meanings on the different fragrant substances behind it. And it is also the middle of that page, which has the old original Marg logo in Hindi in the center of that. And I thank Alexander very much for allowing us to be able to use perfume and to be able to use his painting with our logo and impregnate it with a particular fragrance. This is the same fragrance which is suspended in the ittar bottles through the room. Do please spend a moment to be able to sniff these bottles. They've got that mitti and vetiver or khas blend. The blend has been made by Ahalya Mathan for Marg. As I thank her, I'd also like to be able to thank the rest of my editorial team, Nandini Bhaskaran, Aditya Mohanan, and Malvika Madgulkar, who's here this evening. This particular issue has been designed by Parvati Venkataraman based on a design template by Yamini Gandhi. I thank you all very much for having done the work that you have. The value of fragrance has long been noted in the history of India, yet specific histories of blending and distilling it appear to have, well, dare I say it, wafted away, leaving but a few old traces. We end this particular volume of Marg with the travails of a blender whose recipes cannot always be maintained in the wake of modern retail or the changed agricultural economy that we are confronted with. With a background in the social sector, Geeti Dutt is now completing her PhD in anthropology, conducting fieldwork across the life cycle of Indian attars. Geeti's research unearths the cultural, historical, and social dimensions of perfume, shedding light on their enduring significance in contemporary India. She is a perfumer herself. And an article by Malayka Shirazi, who will also be speaking to us this evening. Malayka is a researcher, she's a writer, she's a filmmaker with an interest in meaning making, and one which she explores through work on Urdu lexicons, smells, ecology, the ideas of fandom and queerness. She's worked extensively on Attar and the Attar sellers of Old Delhi as a researcher for an exhibition called Sensing the City. Her work was published by the Kiran Nadar Museum. It was an exhibition called Smells Assembly, sorry. She's also written on issues of caste in Islam, the multilinguality of Islamic culture, and on niche fandom writing in India. She's a video producer, and we'll be hearing from her about her research that went into this particular volume. As I end with my list of long thank yous, I wanted to say that Perfume is an agent of transformation. It transports you, like Vidya does, knowledge. Gandha, the word gandha, fragrance, is also a transformative agent that can alter our sensibilities and transport us. The humblest shack is pleasant, charming even, because it is fragrant, and what palace remains a palace if it stinks? No wonder the two, Vidya and Gandha, were personified in Indian iconography as Vidyadhara and Gandharva, always shown as aerial beings capable of transporting us from one realm to another. James, thank you very much. May I please invite you to transport us somewhere else in this volume?
Thank you for that. And yes, I want to start with a few thanks as well, because I want to thank you, Norman, for inviting me to do this at quite a year or two ago now.
Yeah.
And then actually the whole team at Marg. I've published a few things, and this has been the most amazing experience. They've made it so beautiful, and the editing's so good and so detailed and so right to get the tone right, because academics can be unreadable, and Marg do a good job of like making it readable, and the designers, and of course the contributors, and actually the informants, because the more ethnographic pieces, they've dealt with various people, so thank you. I don't know if any of those managed to make it, but some of the informants, sorry, does it need to be a bit higher? Sorry. Oh, yeah, thank you. Some of the informants in Delhi, and the IIC also, and the sponsors. Okay, that's my thanks. I thought today what I'll do is just talk a little bit about how I ended up looking into smell and perfumery and things like that, and what I found when I did my book on this. Just briefly, I'll sort of introduce some of that. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Marg and how that sort of shaped up, and there was a lot of directions we could have gone, and then think about where we could go next, because there's a lot of work to do, all sorts of directions to go. Yeah, so actually I started looking at Indian culture. I was doing a philosophy degree, and it was very dry Anglo-American philosophy, which is all mathematical logic and things like that, and it's sort of rather dry, put it mildly. And I took a class on Buddhism, and it was all Indian Buddhist philosophy. And I was very blown away and impressed by that. And the professor that taught that did Sanskrit. So I was like, start taking some classes with that. And, I'm just this person from Leeds. I didn't know anything about stuff like that. And so I started hanging around with him, and I got really interested in this philosophy. But then, sort of when one visited India or went to a Hindu temple, these older books on things like Indian religions were very much like the philosophy and didn't address a lot of what you actually saw. Say, if you take another book like What the Buddha Taught, which was very big back in then, it's all meditation and philosophy, and really it actually even has this very sort of clear statement that, statues and flowers, they're like not part of this religion, really. So I was always a bit frustrated about that and wanted to know more. And that was kind of in my background. And then when I started my PhD, I was doing a class on Buddhist monasteries and looking at these Pali texts. And I got really interested in the parts of the Buddhist monastic rules that tell you about, what to wear, when to shave, what kind of stuff to do with your hair, what kind of toothsticks you're allowed, what kind of toothstick cases you're allowed. It gets very detailed. And so I was writing about that, But then I sort of realized none of it sort of made sense, because it's a list of like, you shall not wear this perfume, you shall not use this kind of two-stick. And it's like, well, what's wrong with that one as opposed to that one? I realized I was missing the kind of positives, if you a list of prohibitions only makes sense when you know what people are mostly doing or would like to do. So that got me like looking a bit deeper into perfumery. And then at that point I had the great fortune to discover this amazing Indian scholar who some of you may be aware of, this guy P.K. Gode, who was in Pune, and he published, so G-O-D-E, P.K. Gode, amazing. And he did these volumes on Indian cultural history and Indian literary history, and they're all scanned and on archive.org. I'm pausing to emphasize that because they're so good, and you can just get lost in those for days, whatever you're interested in. Like anything. So I discovered his work, and he had actually discovered, because I really didn't, I was sort of aware of sort of main famous Sanskrit texts, but I wasn't aware if there were any texts on perfumery when I was doing this Buddhism thing. And I wanted to know, well, what perfumes were people wearing as opposed to forbidden to wear? And he'd discovered these perfumery texts in the Bhandarkar library in Pune, and written about them. And so I was like, oh wow, we actually have recipes and perfumery texts. And so I kind of got those texts out, and they were just, difficult. I don't know if anyone's ever had to deal with ancient recipes, but ancient recipes are really difficult. You've got plant names, herb names, and they don't really tell you what to do in the way, modern recipes do. Very, very difficult text to deal with. So I spent lots of years working on that kind of thing. And then I also wanted to look at other sources about what kinds of things people did, not just the recipes, so literary texts, medical texts, things like these legal texts, because some people have to sort of forgo garlands for various reasons and things. So lots of different sources. And you run into a lot of problems, though, in terms of actual social history, because it's all very artificial, it's all very literary, it's all very stylized. Sometimes you'll have a text that's a classic and people are using for centuries and interpreting and reinterpreting, but it's kind of hard to know what people are really doing with a lot of these ancient and medieval texts. So lots of methodological problems of like, is this just does this have any connection to reality and things like that? So those are the kinds of problems I dealt with. But I did this sort of big survey of everything I could find out about smell. And one thing I really wanted to do, in fact, is I wanted to let the sources, sort of the Indian sources, sort of speak for themselves. I mean, one thing that comes up if I'm in America or Europe talking about smell, and I say smell, I'm doing smell, that people will talk about memory. They'll be like, oh yeah, smell and memory. And that, that really is a sort of relatively recent European thing to emphasize in sort of European thought. Sort of smell as primal and emotional, and therefore connected to these sort of deep things like memory. But I wanted to see what the Indian sources emphasize, say, in literary sources, and it's not memory, in fact. So, for example, memory is not the thing with smell in medieval India. What is the thing is, think of the bee in the flower. It's going after the smelly thing. It's like, I smell something, I'm in the forest and I go, what's that amazing smell? It's just mind-blowing. I've got to go and find the source of that smell. And so I go and chase the source of that smell. You have Matsya Gandhi in the Mahabharata, and that's a good example of it. But also the bee in the flowers, a good one. So this idea of going to the thing where the smell is, and that's actually really interesting, though, to think about, because it's a sort of social connector. You experience the smell in these literary texts that creates in you strong emotion. And in philosophical classifications, there's two types of smell, good and bad smell, an objective property of the smelly thing. And then you have this strong emotion, and then it makes you act. And it makes you act in sometimes it's a bee, it's a flower, but often it's a person. And you meet that person. So it's very powerful. It has this very powerful effect, and it can arouse you. So that's I wanted to sort of emphasize that rather than doing this kind of things like memory and psychoanalysis and sort of imposing that on the smell material. You were talking about packaging there. Some of the sort of, I'm just going to give you a few quirky things I discovered. They didn't have, well, they probably did have packaging, I don't really know, but they had like really, what's amusing, and there was no advertising or anything like that, but the perfumes, probably from about 1400, did have really quirky names. So, for example, there's one called Kolahala, which is sort of like chaos, madness, which is obviously if you wear this and you kind of go in a room, everyone's going to be just so amorously, erotically excited. There's just going to be like madness ensue. There's another one that's sort of the shame of a respectable married woman is the name of this perfume. And it's just like, you're going to get in trouble if you wear this. And then my favorite one is this incense, and it's the rest. It gives you the recipe. I actually made this once. You make this incense and you fumigate your clothes with it. We've got some nice images of people fumigating hair. You fumigate your clothes, and if you do that, when you walk down the street, everyone's going to go, Koga Chetty. It's just like, who? Who is he? Who's he going there? You know what I mean? And that's the name. That's the name of this incense. I don't know. Dating these things is hard, but 1300, something like that. No advertising. So anyhow, that was very charming, this sort of playfulness in these Sanskrit texts. Another thing that came out was whether is this gendered or not, and it really wasn't that gendered, to be honest. For the most part, there didn't seem to be. There's deodorants which are sort of gendered, but actually the sort of positive smell culture, it seems to be the perfumes are same for both genders really. So that was the sort of striking difference. Where it's, especially in America, it's so gendered. It's cologne and perfume. There's all these. It's all very complicated. And actually teaching in America, I used to sometimes hand around like a flower, like to a big room like this. And the female students would typically go, oh, smell it. And you'd have these sort of frat bro types, sort of like with a giant coffee that big and, baseball cap. And they would literally be, oh, I don't want to. And they would not want to be seen in public smelling a flower because that would be this damaging to their masculinity. So anyhow, that is not the case. Actually, here we are. This image here sort of sums up that is not a problem in India. Another thing is that actually the period I'm looking at, they weren't distilling and they weren't making ittars. So you actually had a lot of different formats and formats of perfume. So incenses, pastes, oils, things you chew. And you use them at different times of day. So you'd start out with bathing ones and sort of rubbing ones, and then you'd have pastes and hair oils and mouth ones. And incense is very much for the evening and the bedroom, which actually is also how they structure perfume texts, sort of from morning to evening in terms of the structure. But you had to combine them right. There's this, so you had to get the right garlands with the right incense and everything like that, or it was like wearing the wrong colours together. People really, apparently they knew about that. There's one Sanskrit text, first millennium probably, and in that there's a story about well, it's a complicated story, but basically somebody is trying to test if somebody's really a perfume expert and deliberately burns the wrong incense to go with the wrong flowers, and it's just like, oh, that's terrible. And the guy, he proves he knows about perfume by kind of feigning a migraine and going, and it's like, what's wrong? And it's like, well, you just did it's like the worst perfume with not that perfume and that garland. It's just disgusting. And so you really had to get that right too. And another thing to emphasize as well, that was a problem when I started thinking about that, is dealing with visual materials and scent. And this is something I talk about in introduction, is actually, fortunately, and this comes from sort of some Indian philosophical sources, that, things that have the property of odor are often, in some philosophical contexts, they also, they're visible and they're also tangible. And you can hear them at a pinch, like you can hear a piece of clay in some contexts. And things like that. So things that have the property of smell are multisensory. So, and this was actually emphasized in India. So you do have, flowers you can see, or paste you can see, and things like that. So I sort of used that as a sort of framework for thinking. It's like we can have pictures of sandalwood and things like that. And actually, that's a really good point to bear in mind, that unlike you have no idea, any of you, if I'm wearing scent, do you? I could be wearing perfume or not. But if this was like 1,500 years ago in India, you would see it. I'd have a garland, I'd have like paste, you know, I'd have various things on, you could actually see it, which you still can in a lot of temple contexts. If you think of Tirupati, huge piece of camphor, the Naman in Tirupati, this massive piece, huge, enormous slab of Borneo camphor, Pachikapura. So that's just a little bit about perfume in general. And I'll now turn to the Marg. When Narman approached me about this, I was a little bit daunted, to be honest, because it's this iconic, famous magazine. I ran into it at graduate school. These old ones, in fact, really old ones. These beautiful things, sort of bound in cloth and things like that. And I was like, oh, I can't do that. But we discussed it and we came up with some ideas. And actually, one of the problems there was like, where do we even begin? Smell was something smell-ish was the sort of idea. And then we were like, well, where do you even go with that? Because you could do smells, you know what I mean? Or smelly things. You could do stinks. And like I said, there's abstinence. You could do absence of smells or sort of avoidance of smells, you know what I mean? There's all sorts of ways you could go. So we talked about it, and we thought we'd go with perfume and perfumery. The substance, the people who make it, the process of making it and using it and trading it and consuming it. So that sort of enabled us to narrow it a bit. And obviously that's quite visual as well, because you're often going to have a blob of stuff or a bottle of stuff or a shop or a person pounding something. So, it turns itself into visual materials quite well. And given my background, I thought I'd go with historical sources mostly, but was very open-minded. And above all, I really wanted to work with sort of new scholars, junior scholars, younger scholars, and sort of freshen up the field. In a way, the last thing I wanted was a reflection of my previous work. I was like, I feel like a one-hit wonder of smell. And I was like, I don't want any more of that. I want new material. So that was the sort of basic idea. And then another thing I wanted to avoid was the sort of the classic thing you get, and you do need this, but like a huge, enormous focus on sort of piles of rose petals and itters. I mean, we do have some really fresh material on itters, which I'm really, really pleased with. It's like, I think it's the most interesting, original stuff written about it for ages, if ever. But I really wanted to avoid that sort of National Geographic thing, which has been done and done and done, and it's always interesting and it's valid and it is part of it, but it's been done. You know what I mean? You can just find loads of articles online about that. So I wanted to avoid that and have really things I'd never seen myself. I wanted to be surprised, and so I invited everyone along and said, just do your thing, do what you want, surprise me, confuse us. Don't feel like you ought to sort of follow the classic line of Indian perfumery history. Do something new, and I think everyone did a really great job. So what I'm going to do is maybe just go over some of the papers and just sort of say what struck me about those. Let's see. So yeah, we start with Ahuja's. I'm not going to sort of zoom over them like that, but we have this fabulous piece on knotting garlands by Ahuja Mathan. And that was just really fascinating to me, because with garlands, it's like they're so. I really had no idea. I'd seen garland markets and garland makers, but she really follows the process from picking them you have to pick them in a very specific state, and these very specific knotting things. And then she worked with a really good artist to do. And doing clear pictures of tying knots is something else. So we've got these extremely crisp images of knot tying, which are just fabulous, these hands. And it's funny, we're going to smell something later, which involved quite a lot of fiddly handwork. And it was really striking that the people, we'll smell it in a bit. And the people that were making it, though, they were all going, oh man, my fingers, it's like killing me this, you know what I mean? It's like, so this, it's really, really specialized dexterous work. So that was, a whole completely new to me, and I'd always been curious about that. And then we have, we basically work somewhat chronologically, but it's, hard to sort of be super exacting about this. Emma Flatt did this fabulous piece on incense and incense practices, these sort of things like astrological incenses in the early modern Deccan, and she has some really good images on that. And we talked, I was in touch with her a lot about that, and she runs into quite a lot of the same problems as me about, what exactly do these words mean? And sometimes I'll have perfumers contact me and go, oh, can you give me a recipe? And I'm like, well, this word could mean about these 3 things. We're not sure. And so this is actually, if anyone's interested in that more, like, how can I make this? I want to smell this. It's hard to know for sure what some of these words mean. So I used to struggle with that and used to spend like months and months trying to obsessively get the thing, but I've now accepted it's often quite underdetermined. And then we have this piece by Neha Vermani about Mughal dining aromas. And that's another thing that fits in with the multisensory aspect. That like, and this applies to medieval Europe as well, that the sort of distinction between, say, a medicine, a food spice, and a perfume, it's not, it's confusing. It's not, the boundaries not always clear. So, foods can be perfumed. Something like pan, what is pan? You know what I mean? Is it food? Is it perfume? What is it? Actually, when pan first appears, I did this when I was looking at the alcohol thing. When some of the earliest references in Pali to pan that we have, they very much class it as a perfume. It's very much classed as a mouth perfume at the beginning when pan first appears. Not food and not medicine so much. But so Neha's piece is on food and smells, which really emphasizes this. But she's got loads of images of that, so it's sort of perfect illustration of the multisensory thing. And then we have these 2 pieces by Nicholas Roth, and he's this amazing. He's got written other things. Look him up. And he's one of these people. He really knows a lot about plants. It's a bit terrifying, in fact, how much he knows about plants. But he can look. It's really amazing because he can look at say these miniature paintings, and he can identify every plant, and he can even go, oh, that's this very specific type of narcissus that's like, and it's really amazing. But then he'll sort of connect that in his research to things like poetic texts in Urdu and Persian and various sort of forms of older Hindi. And then he'll sort of work out the significance of it, or maybe it has a gendered significance or a seasonal significance. So he's able to do this deep floral reading of art and poetry, and he can even then stick a photo in of the flower in question. So it's really remarkable what he does. So they're great. And then I think I mentioned sort of methodological issues with this, and one other thing is people are often keen to reconstruct these things. I've done this myself. People sometimes ask me to do it. And Shireen Hamza's piece on these sort of perfumed travel sickness lozenges is all about, it's about the lozenges, but it's also about her quest to reconstruct them and see what she can learn from that. Meditations on that, because it's not clear. What can you get from reconstructing things? Are you ever going to have the nose of the time? The famous example of that is that substance wintergreen. That I don't know about in India, but in England it's an ointment. It's like a sort of pink ointment smell. But Americans sort of put it in things like chewing gum, and they sort of enjoy it. Whereas to me, that's like this weird, 1970s ointment smell, but Americans are like, oh, I love wintergreen, it's delicious. So you can have these different, culturally conditioned responses to perfume. So obviously, with 1,000 years difference, or 500 years difference, these things can change again. So some really interesting reflections from Shireen on that. And then, I won't talk about Projit's piece, because he's going to talk in a minute, but we're going to hear more from him soon. But he has told me about he's got these amazing collections of old bottles and labels and all sorts of things. And I don't actually, he's very modest, but he had this. I don't know if it's still around. You had this amazing blog called Calcutta by Gaslight, which is just the most amazing thing ever. It's just a fabulous source on sort of ghost stories and rumors and cool matchboxes from old Calcutta. Anyhow, so I was very pleased that he had material and could join us. And then, like we've mentioned, Aditya Harchand already. He was interested in working on these little, they must have been like these really cheap little, printed books from about pamphlets, these little booklets, Tamil pamphlets from like about 1900 and sort of around that period. And he's working on that as a general topic, but he had ones that had these sort of home remedies and perfumes and things. And yet again, what's interesting, and so he talks about them, and they've got these really charming, they're in these really delightful little sort of engravings or whatever they are, sort of woodblock block prints. I don't know what format they are, but they've got these really good little images. And yeah, again, they're not just perfumes, or they're perfumes with medicinal values, or snuffs. And, so snuffs, if you think now, tobacco goes hand in hand with pan, and then there's itters in the pan, and there's a kind of spectrum of these things, which is, say, not the same spectrum you'd have in Europe. And then we have these three fabulous pieces on itter. So Amanda Lancio's thing is really good sort of history, 19th century history of what was going on with itter making and how that changed. Completely new to me. She has all these amazing Urdu texts on itter making. And she sort of goes into this is actually a really good point, because people are always really interested in old recipes, but it's like, why did people write old recipes? You know what I mean? Like, in very traditional context, the person who made that thing did not need a recipe. So when you get an ancient recipe, you always got to think, why on earth was anyone writing that? Say, departing from, perfume, but say you have these Tamil temples with sort of food recipes sometimes carved on the walls. It's not so they know what to do, it's because somebody sort of endowed money, and you've got, like these ladus will have this much jaggery, you know what I mean? And it's in stone. So it's not telling you how to make it. It's like a legal, if you skimp on the jaggery, you're like betraying the person who gave this donation. So always think with ancient recipes what they're there for. And then we have a really good piece from Geeti Dutt on itter, which is fascinating. Actually, my take home from that is this line she was told is like, itter is a process, not a substance. So it's not a substance, it's a process. It's a thing made in a very specific way, as opposed to a ruh. But read the article. And then Malayka is going to talk in a minute, so I'll let her tell you about her fabulous piece. But yeah, really rich original material on itters, which has not been done before. So this is great. And so where should we go in the future after this, having been sort of floating around worlds of smell for quite a while now? Well, I think just kind of carry on in the same vein. So, like say Aditya Harchand's material on these Tamil pamphlets, there must be all sorts of things like that floating around. Various languages, various areas, various periods. This is one of these things where one scholar can't do it. You need collaboration. You need to have conference and workshops and bring people in that are sort of good at sort of, old varieties of Hindi and other languages, for example, and who have worked out how to find some of these archival materials, which often might be quite hard to find. So hopefully that kind of material will be one way to go. I'm actually really interested in sort of modern Indian perfumery. And we get a taste of this with actually this material, which we might hear about in a minute, of the itter shops. The itter shops don't just sell like these, like the thing we're going to smell, a very sort of traditional, natural thing, which is what people tend to write about and emphasize and love. But if you actually go to those shops, I was just in Bhopal, and there's loads of really good itter shops in Bhopal. They have the itters, but they're mostly the big, I asked them all, what's the big thing at the moment? And there's this bright blue, what is it, CR7 by Cristiano Ronaldo. But it's their remix of it. And I think there's this tendency to think it's got synthetic materials in and it's just a fake. But no, it's not, because these are like creative reinterpretations. They don't steal a recipe. It's like a remix. They smell it. They think, well, what do people around here like? What materials do I have? what's been a hit in the past, and they're sort of creative remixes for, say, the Bhopal audience, and they don't care, they're not worrying about natural versus synthetic. They'll just sort of do what it takes to make it beautiful. And I really think people should accept that and look at that material more, because it actually, if you're looking at traditional ITA shops, that is what they sell most of. In fact, including Gulab Singh Johimar, it's like they're big sellers, things like that. And I was smelling some yesterday, and it's like, these are really good, in fact. So yeah, and not just those small scale ones, but things like Axe. I mean, it'd be really interesting to do a sort of ethnography of like the head perfumer of the India Axe. But like, that person must have such a sort of India smell whisperer. You know what I mean? That person really, really knows what people are into, like no one else. And that would be so interesting to, do an ethnography with someone like that and sort of let go of I mean, of course, I'm interested in things like natural and traditional. That's what I do. But I think we should look into that more. Yeah, so, well, actually, I think I'm sort of somewhat running out of time now, so I don't want to go on too long. I think there's a lot of new ways we can go, be really open-minded. And I really did find the materials when people suggested topics and when the materials came in, I was just really blown away by, these were things I had never thought of, directions, and actually, especially with Malayka's material, I was like, oh, I have been such a snob, because I have been to these shops, and I have been like, oh, put those horrible, put magnet away. I don't want CR7. Bring me the Asli Roo, you know what I mean? And I have been that person for years, and I was like, oh, James, like this, there's an amazing thing happening right under your nose, and you're just this total snob about it, and you've been ignoring it. And so, but the whole Marg, in many ways, sort of had that effect on me. I realised, oh gosh, wow, that's embarrassing. I never even thought about that. So yeah, so I think things are moving in the right direction, and yeah, and I'd be interested to see what everyone in the audience. I'm sure people have got really interesting stories, things they know about, things they're interested in, or things they would like to hear more about. So yeah, well, thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so first of all, thank you to Naman for organizing this, and thank you to my old friend James for having brought us together for this wonderful panel. And the issue, it's fabulous, it smells fabulous, and it looks fabulous. I would also, so I decided not to actually talk about my contribution to the issue, because you can read it if you like. It's about the center of the Indian incense industry in Chicago, which is controlled entirely by Lithuanian Jews. But you can you can read about that if you want. But what I thought I could do instead was, like Naman very kindly mentioned, there were these storyboards, and I've contributed some of my little throwaway things that I keep piling up at home, and I could give you a little bit more context about that, because those are not like, I've not written about them there. So can I move? Okay. Okay, so let me start with this one. There on top is a lovely bottle of something called Jobakushum Tel, which is still around. Many people would know it. And it's a lovely bottle because it's inscribed in like English, Bengali, Hindi, or Devanagari, and Urdu scripts, which is pretty rare for that age. This is from around the 1880s or so, and at that, the 1880s, 1890s, and at that point, we didn't make glass bottles in India of this quality. So this was probably made most likely in Germany or somewhere. So to get four different scripts on it is pretty interesting. But even more interesting is the advert, or a part of the advert from September 1896 over there. Now, I don't want you to read it, or you're welcome to read it if you want, but you don't need to. All that I want to draw your attention to is look at the people who are writing testimonials for this. Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, the great Bengali novelist, R.C. Dutt, the great historian. So you have literally the who's who of late 19th century modern history books who are trying to sell you a fragrant hair oil, which is, I think, classic. And this is not just, and this is like I mentioned, this is a brand that's continued. So it's not just 1890s. And so the ad that you have right over here, this very modern design, this is done by Satyajit Ray. So this is a product that's continued, but it's not just the fact that it's like great names have been involved in trying to market it. But I think it's also impacted the kind of work they themselves have done. So the picture of that lady standing on the shore there is from a 1919 edition of 1911 or 1919, I forget, edition of Kopal Kundala, one of the most famous of Bankim Chandra's novels. And in that, of course, the heroine, when she's first introduced to us, he goes on waxing eloquent about how lovely her hair is, how long it is, how fragrant it is, and that's what the illustrations are also showing. But when you keep in mind that when he was writing that, he was also writing testimonials for this hair oil company, that gives you a different kind of sense. So there's something that we have come to think of, and that Kopal Kundala is often referred to in Bengali literary history as the quintessentially modern heroine that we get in like modern novel. Bankim Chandra invents it, of course, and then the quintessentially modern heroine, and the modern notion of feminine beauty is probably being shaped by this humble little bottle that he's trying to sell, and maybe he's getting paid for selling it. I don't know. Okay, so moving on. Next, of course, no prizes for guessing who that gentleman is. Rabindranath Tagore selling Kuntolin hair oil once again. Another famous name. So Kuntolin was produced by Hemen Bush, a very famous inventor who was also the first one to make movies in India. He was the first one to import bicycles, to make records like LPs, not LPs, but like the grandfather of LPs, whatever they were called. So Hemen Bush was an inventor, but he also came up with Kuntolin. But what is important about Kuntolin is, once again, if you look at its connections with literature, it's not just accidental that Tagore is advertising it. Kuntolin then starts a literary prize, an annual literary prize that people have to send in stories, and they win. And a lot of authors who have later become pretty famous actually win the Kuntolin prize. And this is a big thing that they keep sending into, and particularly for genre fiction, and much of these things like science fiction, detective stories. So Dinendra Kumar Rai, who becomes a major detective fiction writer, he first wins the Kuntolin prize. I have here the cover of Jagadish Bose, the famous scientist, J.C. Bose. He writes a science fiction story, which is probably one of the first science fiction stories. And he writes it for the Kuntolin Prize, and he wins the prize. It's a story about a cyclone that he somehow manages to control using a bottle of Kuntolin, which is product placement at its best. So from Kopal Kundala to Jagadish Bose, everybody's doing product placement. And we just give slack on like Amitabh Bachchan for doing this. So anyway, and then finally, so that is an image that you will find in the Marg issue, Bhutnath oil. This is something, unlike Kuntolin and Jaba Kushum, this is not as well known. But Bhutnath oil actually was, a man named Kishorilal Chaudhary, who was originally from Patna, but based in Calcutta. He ran this. It was a very, very popular brand. And his manager, the man who oversaw the production, was a man called Navjadiklal Srivastav. And Navjadiklal Srivastav himself is a small-time Hindi author, but he is known for bringing together some of the greatest Hindi modern authors, including he's the first publisher of Suryakant Tripathi Nirala, and Nirala is actually published, and they all congregate at the hair oil office. They call themselves the Matwala Mandal because they sit around sniffing perfumes and hair oil all day. And actually, when Nirala first publishes his first breakout poem is Juhi Ki Kali. And that's about the love of jasmine with breeze. So a bud of jasmine and breeze, a love affair. That's the kind of first Chayavadi kavita in Hindi. And Nirala's, so I have here 2 bottles, both from my collection, of this Bhutanath oil. But Nirala also is, once again, it's not just, if I may say, it's skin deep, because it goes deeper. He is deeply into perfumes and smells. He gifts people smells. He gets angry if he's not given the best possible smell when in the Matwala Mandal, because they all gift each other fragrances. But if he's not given the best one, then he's like, he throws a fit and he's like, oh, if Tagore was here, you would have given it to him. But just because but I'm as talented as Tagore. So he keeps on saying, I'm as talented as Tagore, and you just treat me badly because I'm not Dwarkanath's grandson. But Nirala is in his personal life also. So Rambilas Sharma, who is a friend and colleague who writes a biography of his, mentions how after he gets married, Nirala puts on such strong perfumes that his wife objects, saying, I can't sleep. You're smelling so much, I can't sleep. And he says that, and in turn he says, well, you know, there's this... He says that I'll tell you a story. The story is that once a fisherwoman was passing by a king's orchard with lovely flowers, and she was tired and she tried to sleep. But she couldn't sleep because she couldn't stand the nice smell till somebody put a basket of stinking fish next to her, and then she could smell, and that's you. So they have, naturally, this doesn't end well. They fight, and Nirala's wife is like, what to do? But Nirala's wife's retort is also interesting. She's like, do you think I'm a prostitute that I'm going to smell like that? And he's like, you smell like fish. I'm not going to sleep next to you. So the night ends badly. But you know, he also interestingly, so this is just one thing, but smell is very much a part of his imagination, his poetry, his personal life, his sociality. It's all about smell. And he also uses a word, fulel, which we don't use anymore. Now we always just say itr, but he says itr fulel often. And fulel is like it's a word for an essential oil, a fragrant oil extracted from flowers. So it's also, the process of it is interesting. So he's from, Nirala's originally from the Unnao kind of region, even though he's born and raised in Bengal. So so there are like interesting histories of production over there as well. But anyway, so my point behind all this, and here is another H. Bose advertisement that features Tagore, Surendranath Banerjee, who else is there? Motilal Nehru, and I forget who's on top. I can't read it. So, sorry, who's there? Okay, this is too small. It's Tilak, yes, of course. How could I forget? It's Tilak. So you know, you can tell the whole history of modern India practically through a history of fragrant hair oil. But it's the fact that we don't say that, and the fact that we don't even know about Bhutanath oil today, that we would not have had Hindi literary modernism without that company. We would not have had Bengali science fiction without Kuntolin. So we might not have had Kopal Kundala without Joba Kushum. So my point being that we need to, I think, not just write the histories of smell for its own sake, and this goes back to what James was saying, that there's enough of that. Like we'll do the lovely process, the exotic little ether production process that National Geographic will feature or whatever, but there's a way in which the writing out of smell from other topics has also left us without a fuller understanding of how that history worked. What happened? So smell is not just smell here, but smell is also a cue into understanding what literary modernism is, at least in Bengali and Hindi's case. I'm sure we could probably unearth similar stories for other Indian languages if we went looking. But at least these two major languages, which have had massive literary modernisms in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, somehow they both give very central place to fragrant hair oils. And it's not just an economic history, because I think the business history and the economic history then gets into the history of the social networks through which literary production happened, and the aesthetic taste and the new modern taste. And this runs completely counter to the kind of argument that's been made about Europe, that modernity is about the suppression of smells. And it's, again, as James was saying, in India it doesn't work, because I think literary modernism, these guys are like all about smell. The people who are creating the modern aesthetic, the modern sensibility for us, are entirely into smell. So thank you, and as that PM Bugji label says, forget me not about smell.
Malayka, would you like to read from here or up on
Either way is fine.
whatever you're comfortable with?
I'm just going to present what this is before.
Oh, before.
Yeah.
Okay.
So is this?
So now we have a real treat coming.
I'll explain what it is.
A double treat.
I'll do this first,
Yes.
and then you can,
Okay.
in terms of timing, because this takes a bit of time. So 1 second. So yeah, we've got something to smell, because it would be wrong not to have something to smell. So I just picked this up this afternoon. They made it specially for us at Gulab Singh Johimal. They used to make these for the old wedding back in the day, but he was like, we've not made one of these for decades. So they're a traditional thing, but you don't see them much anymore. And it's a bottle gourd with vark and these little sticks, and they're dipped in mogra, blue mogra, which is what the perfumer there suggested. So I don't think there's enough for everyone to have one, unfortunately. So I'm gonna Malayka is gonna hand this round, and I think the way, if you're like two people, what you can do is you can pull it off and maybe knead it and split it. You know what I mean?
Please share,
Yeah,
because we haven't
and,
got for everyone.
And traditionally, I mean, probably some of you know this, but the traditional thing to do with one of these is you can just smell it, or actually, there's a picture of there's quite an early picture in the Marg of somebody with them. It's at a V&A in London, but it's mislabeled. But it's the guy's holding a load of these. But what you traditionally do is you sort of take it off, roll it up, and stick it in your ear there, and then you keep dabbing, and then anything that's on your fingers, you just do that. You know what I mean? So this is Mogra, and sorry for, but I wanted to get this going, but it fits with the talk. So.
Should I just... Thank you. Hello. Yeah, please take a minute to play with it. It's actually really interesting, isn't it? Okay, meanwhile, I will thank Naman and James for a lovely introduction. And am I not audible? Is this better? Sorry. Yeah, I would like to thank Naman and James, as I was saying, for this evening and for just these lovely introductions to the issue. My name is Malayka. I have written a piece on the store this flower came from, Gulab Singh Johimal, in the issue. But before I delve into the store itself and the specificities of Itra, the Itra industry, I thought I'd start with my first memory of an Itra, because it's such a personal experience for most of us. Sorry about the mention of a memory. Anyway, yes, so I was around 4 years old. I was following my grandfather around. He was supposed to take me to the Eidgah for Eid. And I was near his cupboard, and it had a very rusty smell. We remember the smells for most of these events. And he pulls out this bottle and he dabs something on himself. And I don't remember it smelling very good. I didn't enjoy the smell, but I remember the smell. He had one for Eid, which is called the Janatul Firdaus, very popular smell name, and one for the Friday Namaz, which was the Hina Nawabi. And yeah, so over my years of research on Itra, I came across many Janatul Firdaus and many Hina Nawabi. None smell like those two, like that room. And which made me a little curious. So as an anthropological exercise, I would go around, I'd hand someone a bottle of mogra, and I'd ask, what do you think this smells like, without telling the name. And they'd say, it smells like the rue gulab. Or I'd ask someone at at a masjid, at Jama Masjid or any other place, what are you wearing? And they'd say Janatul Firdaus, and which didn't smell, again, very different smells. So what was settling in slowly was that this was pointing towards an ephemerality of smells. But it was also, what eventually began settling in was that this ephemerality renders the experience of a smell both intimate and complex. It's not something that exists in and of itself and that's uniform across experiences. So then when you're studying smells, how do you study a subject like that that's so quick to escape us? It's not something that's easy to preserve or that's easy to maintain. So in this essay, what I try to do is maintain Gulab Singh Jorimal as an archive proposed Gulab Singh Jorimal as an archive of smells. Let's start with the store. The store is in Old Delhi. Most people who know about it know about the store. It's synonymous with Itri production in Delhi. It has 2 stores. They have a very large inventory. They have the Rue Gulab, Rue Khas, Rue Motia, any pure distillate you can imagine, they have it. And they make it themselves. They also have another branch in Katra Balyan, which opened 100 years ago because they had a huge demand for smells, for Itr. And I won't go into the trade aspect. You can read that in the essay. But when I went there, what I found very interesting was that they had this peculiar practice of perfumery. They were practicing it in front of me, which was Kushal Gandhi, who's there, who heads the Katra Balyan branch, and he's their perfumer who one can say invents the newer perfumes, newer scents. He was sitting there, and people would walk up to him with requests for a Gucci perfume, or they would ask for what was it mentioned earlier, the one in Bhopal?
I don't know, C7.
C7.
Ronaldo.
Yes, stuff like that. He would get requests like every hour. Someone would walk in with that. People ask for it, mogra and rose and all of that, incense for puja as well. But these requests were very peculiar to me and very special. And I watched him smell a very small sample, and he had synthetic fragrances lying around from which he made, I wouldn't call it a replica of the original, because while all of us were sniffing that smell, all of us had different opinions on what it needed, what it didn't need. He created something which was something. And then he took notes about it in his register. And then I come across this register, which is full of different names, different perfumes, so and notes for each perfume. So 3 generations of his family have written in that register. His grandfather, his uncle, himself, all perfumers. And all these notes were strangely revealing so much about the smells people wanted around that time. So Kushal's notes had names like Ferragamo, Estee Lauder, and what scents he put in those samples. Then his uncles had names like Hina, Sadaf, Al-Shifa, which, if you think about it, would coincided with the post-liberalization export boom in the country, and a lot of it was exported to Saudi Arabia from here, from Delhi, from Bombay. And then his grandfather's notes, interestingly, had things like Baba Supari and Bela Jasmine, which are constituents of pan. So, which sort of signal the advent of the tobacco industry, which is one of the biggest purchasers of buyers of Itri today. So, a lot of it, for future work, actually, a lot of Itri production is centered around the pan industry. But what's interesting is, besides revealing these histories of notes and smells, all of this was somehow revealing what people want, and sorry, I'm a little nervous. Not a public speaker, but yeah. Anyway. it was, these notes were revealing materials that were used, and at the same time, this evolution of a synthetic ether. Then from there in the essay, we traveled from Gulab Singh Jorimal to Chitli Kabir, which is a Muslim, which is an old Delhi area in Chandni Chowk, predominantly Muslim traders there. And there you're seeing Itr, which is which a couple of years ago would be marketed as 100% alcohol Itr, and 100% alcohol-free Itr, not alcohol. That's the opposite. Sorry, my bad. 100% alcohol-free Itr, because on Eid or for namaz, generally in Muslims there's no alcohol consumption generally. That evolved from today. When you go, you see people handing out perfume strips. You have bigger stores handing out perfume strips with names which have names like Pink Lady, Safarna, and when you ask them, they say these have French notes and French origins, and it's based on this French perfume. There's that Janatul Firdaus label sits next to Davidoff's Cool Waters in those stores. And it's interesting to see that there's this material evolution happening where, there's rarely you see that alcohol-free label now. These synthetic fragrances are there and perfumes exist, and it's evolving. So I think the question, the piece one, I was trying to ask with the piece is, what do we do with all this information? We have smells, we have, what are these smells revealing? What are these fragrances revealing? Instead of seeking an authenticity to the Itr, to the, other is a process, but ascribing one authenticity which sort of takes away this modern evolution that's very real and that exists around us, what that does. And additionally, what do these smells reveal about our material reality? So, to think about it, I don't think I'll ever find that bottle of Janatul Firdaus that my grandfather had again. But, in searching for it, you find so much about the how it landed up in his cupboard that day, which is, it was a 10 rupee bottle he got from a store, but how was it at that store, for one? So, so the search for smells like that that one has revealed much about the history of how I'm repeating the same thing. But anyway, exploring smell archives gives us the possibility of revealing the faint fragrances that remain of these histories, of finding newer histories in that which has been relegated ephemeral and invisible, and of complicating smells themselves to something beyond a chemical, molecular composition, to a sensory modality. And I think that's what the piece argues for, that that's it actually. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, I think what I'd like to do is start off by saying that, as a final note, I was hard-pressed to be able to find somebody who has been officially working as a nose in India, who is a scientist who works on microencapsulation. And she was somebody, I spoke to a couple of people. One we zeroed in on, but we couldn't include an article by her, you'll recall. And microencapsulation technology is now used everywhere, right? And she had been using microencapsulation for figuring out what the Indian audience really wants. You can put microencapsulation in paper, but also in textile. And you can have microencapsulated underwear, which can have a certain fragrance that can last 150 washes. And she was trying to find certain veshtis and lungis that will work in the Indian environment, which should have certain microencapsulation. So what would be the microencapsulation that would work for her brand, for the perfumes that she was blending, trying to sell in the market in South India? And how would that be different for T-shirts that were being made for the market in North India? And that was her official job. And it was fascinating to be able to talk to her and discover how, what kind of market research is being done in India at the moment, and what are the directions in which the fragrance industry in India is operating, and how much of that is reliant on old cultural memory, and is the market in India really interested in this fresh Mogra, or is it not? And I don't know, but apparently it's not. And I find that hard to believe. I don't know. I'm a snob like the way James was, he claims. But I don't know what you feel about these kinds of issues and the way in which we are going. Anyone? I don't know if there are other things that you wanted to discuss. I think it was fascinating what you said about reading recipes and not having any fixity in terminology. Malayka talked about the ephemerality of smells, but actually it's not so much an ephemerality of smells, it's an ephemerality of words. Words to describe smells, and ephemerality of nomenclature, where the same name can conjure completely different smells, and you're misled, not because of the smell, but you're misled because they've been called the same thing, but they're actually totally different smells. So it's the incapacity of vocabulary to be able to know what it's doing, and therefore it's the limitations of words that we are up against when we need to be able to communicate synesthetically. And this was a problem that we've had with the study of Ragamala paintings in India for the past 100 years of scholarship on Ragamalas. We come up with the same problem. And it's the same issue that now we have with regard to smell. Well, I'm not going to monopolize this conversation, but I was wondering if any of you had anything that you wanted to discuss, or anyone in the audience who wants to discuss something with us. We'd be happy to try and... yes?
You talked about the idea that nobody, in popular culture, we don't take Mogra anymore, something like that. It's not so popular anymore. But when we think of it, thank you. But when we think of it, you tend to like the food, for example, you tend to like the food which you have been brought up with, like what you have been raised with. You will always like, that is the familiar food, your comfort food, something like that. When you come to think of it, not many people are exposed to Mogra these days. Don't you think of that? When I was small, I had bushes of Mogra everywhere, and I know that smell. I know Raat Rani ka smell. I know the idea of rising early morning to that smell. So I'm very comfortable with that smell, to the extent I like it very much. But these days, I don't see a lot of small children having that experience of rising up in terraces and having that fragrance around them. So that might contribute to it.
Absolutely. These issues about cultural memory
Yes.
are extremely important, and cultural conditioning. And I think there is something that is, people will have different personal responses. I think the smell of pure flowers might be something that a lot of people find attractive, but blends are equally important, and new chemical fragrances are creating an impact as well.
Yes, people are more used to air fresheners these days. So what
Right.
can we say about that?
I want to ask, I'm Anjana Bhagat and I'm a practicing aromatherapist. I want to ask Mr. James that why market and people are moving towards synthetic fragrances and perfumes? And what can we do to come back to a traditional natural thing? I know cost is one factor, and what can we do, or people like you who are in writing, how we can influence people? Because I feel that if we use natural substances, we can really benefit ourselves in a very nice way. We will be
Yeah.
more balanced and things.
Let's pass the mic on as well. Yes?
Cool. Yeah. No. Thank you. No. I mean, I think it is important. I mean, in a way, that's why we went with a Mogra, and we're handing that around, because I'm all about the naturals. I love them, and India is very well placed to grow all sorts of, has many. I mean, so many people. The English language just has jasmine, you know what I mean? But like when you're like dealing with Indian languages, there'll be we've got Mogra, which most people, let's say in Leeds. They have no idea what Mocha is. And so India is very well placed for naturals. And I think, but so I think it really, I don't know how to, I mean, I'm not sort of, involved in business and things, but I think there is an increasing interest in this, like say with this issue, and there's a growing sort of artisanal perfumery movement in India, which we didn't really have time to sort of look at.
Yeah.
In
There is
the
a whole
issue.
movement afoot.
And it's sort of big on things like Instagram and things like that.
There are, there's a huge industry which is producing natural, organic materials for fragrances, and it's made such a huge comeback in the aromatherapy industry and so on. But I think we can't, what we are trying to say is that we've got to also look at the other ways of creating perfumes which are currently happening in the contemporary world, which also needs attention.
Yeah, for me, it's not an either or. It's like you can have it both
exactly.
ways, you know what I mean?
And in the Indian history of perfume, I find the Muslims are dominating.
No, in fact, in this volume, we've made sure that we get a long history of Tamil sources and Sanskrit sources as well. What we couldn't touch on was Telugu sources. But perfume has been traded from the ports of India for at least 2 millennia. And we have Roman references in Latin to the importation of perfumes from India, which are pre-Islamic. So there is a long history which is not related only to, there are temple cultures which deal with perfume as much as there are special histories which deal with perfume in a Muslim context as well. So both are there. And in the volume, we've tried to make sure that both are present.
Well, actually, on top of that, there was this long history of export, and so people in Europe thought of India as this sort of land of spices and things. But actually, there's a kind of list of the great perfumes you get in these earlier texts, which is like sandalwood, agarwood, camphor, musk, and saffron, and they come up. This list comes up again and again. And these were often perceived as being from far away. So, I mean, you get sandalwood in South India, but they also talk about, these texts talk about sandalwood islands, kind of remote sandalwood islands. Agarwood was seen as coming from far away, Assam and Southeast Asia. Camphor was coming from like Borneo and Sumatra. Musk was coming from Himalayas and China and Tibet. So it's interesting that within India, often, like medieval India, the most prestigious perfumes were actually exotic imports, but then like sort of people in Europe thought of India as a land of perfumes. I don't know, do you have anything on this in Islam?
I think that answers it.
Second observation, after the COVID, I think the scope of perfume has gone up. Abroad, it's slot machines. You put a coin, you can get different perfumes smell of.
There's a question there.
Mr. James, you were talking about Pali language literature, which was referring about some prohibited perfumes for Buddhist monks.
Yep.
Would you kind enough to elaborate on that, please?
Well, it's actually kind of part of a shared thing, sort of that you get with sort of brahmacharyans as well. That like you won't. It's like basically in ancient India, anyone that's celibate is probably going to be shunning garlands and perfumes. It goes hand in hand with that, if you know what I mean. So it's part of. But that makes a lot of sense of like, well, what do these perfumes do? It's going to be a lot harder to be celibate if you're covered in perfumes and wandering around. So if you're going sort of begging for food, basically people who are celibate and live by begging, they cannot wear perfumes because they're just wandering around going into people's houses, and that's dangerous. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Is there any other question? Yes, there's one in the corner here and one in the corner there. Two opposite places.
Okay, so am I audible?
Yes.
I'll just read out my question. So thank you for such a great presentation and a great panel discussion. It was just like a Stargate sequence from that Kubrick movie. So my question is, while this volume talks about flowers and other fragrant material, which is really apt for perhaps a great first date, but what about the khwabgah or bedroom. I mean, it is scientifically proven that pheromones are more seductive than anything else. So, when uh, have you encountered anything related to the natural musk of body in context of eros? So that was my question.
Who wants to take this on? Body odor and and pheromones. Any
I can say
You
something.
fully run into
Yeah.
pheromones or
So,
hormones.
just a couple of quick things. That first of all, the science of smell is in itself quite problematic in how they try to, like, what is a complex and to go back to Naman's word, immersive experience, trying to reduce it to particular physiological markers. There's some, and that doesn't translate very well. Second thing I'll say is that there's a wonderful anecdote that my good friend Douglas Haynes has a new book on the history of advertising in India, and he has a chapter on Lifebuoy soap and its marketing strategies, and they were trying to tell people that use Lifebuoy to get rid of body odor, and it wasn't working in the translation because nobody knew what body odor was. So so you had to first tell people, this was such a Western idea. You had to first have these programs to convince people that there's a thing called body odor, and then sell the product that had to get rid of body odor. So body odor itself is a very culturally specific thing that has now been generalized thanks to both, not so much the science, but maybe the Western commodity culture of things like Lifebuoy soap.
I mean, sorry to interrupt, but McHugh also suggested the instance of Matsya Gandha in Mahabharata as well. So I was like curious about that.
Yeah, it's like essential for it's essential for the bedroom, basically. Yeah, I mean the Kama Sutra, the man about town, his ideal bedroom is lots of. But yeah, again, it's not just one thing. There's things for the mouth, there's things for the body, there's incense, but it is essential for that. And actually, weirdly though, they do have deodorants for every part of the body.
Yeah, for every part of the body. And I think they also make it a point in a lot of, for students who have studied Indian painting, you will always see, for instance, very large brown armpits marked, and many a student has often commented with Indian miniature, especially of the Akbar period, that why is the emperor always shown with the largest brown stains on his white kurtas, on his white jamas? Why is he always shown with the biggest brown stain in his armpit? And is that a sweat mark? And is it always is it necessary to always show the emperor sweating the most in a painting? And it's not because the emperor is sweating the most. It's obviously he is the most perfumed, probably in the painting, and therefore it's a marker of the itr that is staining the clothes that he is wearing. And so I think there is ways to be able to read the image and imagine that you have to then use your imagination, that it's not actually obliterating the body's own odor, but these are the layers and ways of concealing and revealing the body that are taking place. And what are you concealing it with, and how are you layering it? Which is, I think, what some of these texts like the Kama Sutra and other texts try and conjure, that kind of layering of the smells that you would encounter at different parts of the body. They are as specific as that. Yeah. There's a question here. Yes.
Hi, I'll not take much of your time. It's already 8:30, but
8:20.
8:20 specifics. But I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was a 50-minute ride to get here for me, but it was totally worth it because I totally enjoyed it. I have two questions. You can totally deny one of the questions, keeping the time frame in mind. But firstly, I'm a perfumer myself, so I run a modern Itra brand. So because I believe that the Indian fragrant heritage needs to come for modern contemporary sensibilities, and the Indian sensibilities have changed throughout years. So we need to adapt to those sensibilities while retaining the essence of where we come from. So as a woman in the field, I'm asked a lot of questions in terms of, because the perfumery industry has been male dominated from the start. And so I just want to ask you that, because the perfumery history in itself needs a lot of probing, right? Because that's why a book like this I'm very, very interested in, because the history itself needs a lot of probing. Do you think that we need another probing, like another layer of the women in perfumery history? Have they always taken up the spaces of muses? Or do you think that they were, because you also say that it is linked with literary, and literary itself was male dominated because of various reasons. Perfumery in itself was trade related. Trade itself was male dominated because of historical, geographical reasons and power reasons. So do you think that there's another level of probe that needs to go into the role of women, not just as muses, but creators of sense in the history? I know about like the first Rose Itar created for Noor Jahan, but are there many more names in the history that are kind of faded away, or do we need more probing into that?
Go for it.
Hi, actually that's a great question, and it's a really good question that all of us should be asking. What's interesting, you mentioned Noor Jahan. I think in Geeti's article, she mentions that one of the prevailing myths or stories around it, I wouldn't call it a myth, stories around Itra is that Roo Gulab was made by her mother, and then it was taken on. And so, I mean, we could have the Roo Gulab could have come from a woman, and it's such a lovely story, and for a woman as well. So, yes, I do think a probe is needed. I also think that at the same time, one has to think about, and we can look at some of the essays on Itra production in the issue, about Itra production itself as an industry, and perfumery as not necessarily an art, of course, but also something that's being produced, especially after the 1800s, roughly, when the Mughal courts perfumers are not making for the Mughal courts, but they're making for people, for the British noble and for the.
Thank you. Thank you. Carry on. Yes,
oh, okay.
Exactly.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, for the British nobles and Britishers, and then after that for the middle class Indian. So there's a mass production of perfume, and then people who are working for it, men and women, I'm sure, are not. They're laborers who are given a recipe, as James mentioned, and they're just making these perfumes. So it's an industry, and I think it's a great idea to probe into it and find more. But at the same time, staying cognizant of the limitations historically that would have been there. Yet but I do agree that it's something to look into, and I think in the future, actually, even if regardless of where we find it in the past, it's good that we're finding it in the future. So you're here making it.
Absolutely.
So
Well,
yeah.
I think one of the things that James said about the fact that there is an absence of gender specificity to the fragrances when you buy them at an Ittar shop is a very important remark, because we seem to have a lot of rules about gender, which he said that, as he explained, are such Western notions of gender, and what fragrance must be used by which gender when, and terminology that is linked with that, as perfumes and colognes and aftershaves, and the classification systems which are really not there as separators. Your question also had in it a latent question, which is that if the woman is a patron, and if the woman has agency in demanding certain fragrances, do we need to have that kind of a gendered approach at all, is the question that we are counterposing to you.
Okay.
Because of the fact that these fragrances are worn by all.
Okay.
The other question is that, is attractiveness and feeling attractive and the body image only precluded to a conditioning for a male audience? or for somebody else's benefit, or do you wear a perfume for your own benefit?
It actually makes me curious.
And so if you admit that latter possibility, that you like to smell a certain way for yourself, then we are getting into what I was trying to say earlier about the subjective histories that we are trying to get into, moving beyond gender classification in the questions that we are methodologically asking of the material. We have the possibility to be able to ask a different set of psychological questions of the material, which are not limited by the gender question. But certainly, that's not to say that the gender question shouldn't be asked.
Right. Because
And
what I was curious about, that the fragrances itself are not gendered, but the distinction between a creator and a muse, that is gendered.
yes. Yeah. Yeah. A question here, yes? Yeah.
Yeah, so the question I had in mind was that with the coming of the British, like how did they perceive the culture in like in various parts of India, and how did they interview with it? Like, did they codify it, or because of the way they interacted with the languages? Obviously, they made those modern Indian languages. But what about Itra?
Yeah.
What about perfumes? How did they interact with the sensibilities here, with the production?
When they went native, did nabobs wear perfumes?
Well, the one thing to add to that is if you look at the history of European perfumery, what you think of now as a sort of typical European perfume, sort of French perfume, that only really gets going at sort of like late 19th century with these things with sort of names like sort of Royal Bouquet. But basically, like earlier, they were quite simple, and they were often involving, flower essence, no synthetics, and often would be just like lavender water or sort of rose bouquet. I actually don't know. I think maybe Projit's the person to answer that question. But one thing, just to sort of slightly reframe the encounter, is like what the Europeans were wearing, say, I don't know, so in 1850, was not, your Parisian 1920s perfume. It was probably not that different to an Itter, but maybe had a bit of alcohol involved. So in terms of the smell, yeah.
So I can just very quickly say a couple of things that so when the British come, you have to also be cognizant of that. They were here for a very long time. So they are here by the 17th century. So, and till about the 1890s, the predominant medical paradigm connects illness and ill health to bad smells. So you take, they believe things like plague and cholera happen because of bad smells. Miasma, which is foul smell. So they want to have, good flowery smells are associated also they're a prophylactic, they're a medicinal thing. So it's not just cosmetic, so that's why they use. But there are things like, for instance, they hate the smell of asafoetida, hing, and they're like, how can anybody find this good? Like they call it the devil's dung. So there are some smells that don't translate. But what I'm saying is that generally there is this overwhelming medical concern which leads them to use flower smells. And they're also complaining that there are so many bad smells that's making India a disease prone area where they're constantly falling ill. So the part of it is that. Second part is also there are a lot of who are the British is kind of complicated. So for instance, there's a man called E.J. Lazarus in Benares who makes a huge fortune. He is actually a Welsh Jew born in Calcutta who makes a huge fortune distilling Indian plants for medicinal and perfume purposes and selling it and mass marketing it. And then with the fortune he makes, he actually publishes a lot of Sanskrit texts. So many of the 19th century editions of Sanskrit texts, if you look at who's published it, it's E.J. Lazarus. But E.J. Lazarus so is he British? I don't know whether you'll call a Welsh Jew born in Calcutta British, but he is making a fortune, just ramping up production and using the new techniques of advertising, mass marketing. He's selling even in South Africa.
I was specifically, for example, talking about the British Indian company, British
East India Company.
Let's carry on to, yes.
Doctor said,
Yeah, please ask.
doctors advise against some using deos and strong perfumes and disinfectant perfumes. So what do you say about it?
We're not really equipped to take that on. There's a question over there. Yes.
I think I'm loud enough.
Huh.
I don't need a mic. I went to the Lodi Gardens a few weeks ago, and the Bada Gumbad, the mosque at the Bada Gumbad, the mirabs, the arches have an incense burner
Yeah.
hung from those. I just wanted to know, are there any such permanent, tangible evidence found on temple architecture
Yes, there are.
in pre-Islamic?
Yeah, there are. There is in fact, there are spaces for incense, and smoked incense is very much part of it. So there is one article that James has written in the volume about incense burners, and the representation of incense burners. In fact, there's a beautiful one which is from ancient Kashmir.
But are they on architecture?
They're represented sometimes in sculpture, in narrative sculptures.
Right.
You will see smoked incense.
Right.
But you also get the representation of fragrant flowers at specific locations on a temple wall. And they are not just auspicious transcendental lotuses. Like in Badami, there are specific references to the champa, which are very accurately sculpted on the walls of Badami. We couldn't get a clear enough picture. We discussed putting that Badami champak flower in the book, but we didn't have
Good image.
a good image.
Another following question. Vishnu wears a one mala.
Yes.
Are the flowers specifically picked for their
Yes.
olfactory?
Yeah, not just for their olfactory sensibility. In fact, there are malas which are made only of grass, and there can be malas which are. Everything has an olfactory quality. So even cut grass has a very clear fragrance associated with it. But I don't feel confident to say that the Vishnu Vanmala constituents are selected only for their smells.
Thank you.
I wouldn't be able to say. Yeah.
Thanks.
May I add to that,
Yeah.
if possible? This is actually a little unrelated, but I think since we're talking about fragrances, it's also interesting. The Van Mala or cut grass, for example, a lot of fragrances and our use of them depends entirely on ecology. So while I was researching, I had to ask, this is a question I asked a lot of Itri sellers who make their own Itri. How do you, how do you select, and how is it now with climate change and with production changing, and all of them have something to say about climate change, which is very interesting. There's a drought, we have excessive rainfalls, and they are using very raw material. Sandalwood trade changed, the sandalwood regulation changed the industry so much. The musk deer, as we know, it's almost, which is a good thing actually in a way. We don't have the original musk. We don't want to kill more musk deer. But so to think of these materials as naturally occurring materials, and then to think of this the natural itra and the synthetic itra and fragrances, and also to explore smells in a similar way, to think about the mala and think what space, what time could this be located in, this piece of art. And also I do think that we smell as much as it's a sensory experience, it is also somehow an ecological production.
Yes.
So yes.
Absolutely. The substances that make up all of these things is linked very much to the question of ecology and climate change. Yeah. Okay. I think
one tiny thing. I believe Geeti Dutt is in the audience,
yes,
and
she is.
I just want to sort of shout out to her.
She's another author in the volume.
Yeah,
There's
so
Geeti Dutt at the back over there.
A fabulous piece on itters that will really change how you understand what they are. And Kanoj.
Okay, we'll take
Any more questions?
We'll
Because we're
take
running
one-
out of time.
Last two questions quickly over there, and then that's it. We have to cut it.
Perfume as a roll-on versus perfume as a mist. So in ancient India, I think, or at least there is always a roll-on. So I've never heard of or never seen people decorating themselves with a mist. So
No, well, if you're,
is-
pass the mic on, if you're smoking your body and you're smoking your hair, which was always done traditionally and has always been done, that is like a vapor. That is, it's a smoke. It's, that is being, that your skin and your clothes are being covered in. Pull the mic forward.
So no, they didn't have itters in the ancient period, but you know it was all these different formats. So you'd have a garland, you'd have like the kind of sandalwood paste. So you'd have sandalwood paste, garland. I don't know exactly when it started, but it's a later thing. Yeah, it's a later thing. You don't have it in the early periods.
No,
But yeah, and also you get the one thing you do get with, because itter tends to be sort of dabbed on or smeared on. But if you think rosewater shakers, they're a little bit like misting, if you know what I mean, and they come up in the Mughal period, the rosewater shakers.
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Yeah, this is something related to this follow-up. Like, as you were mentioning, in the ancient and early medieval period, this has a the smell has a multi-sensory property to it. And if we see when it Persianate or Arab, especially in the Islamic incursion, does that property has it more or less that that sensory aspect attached to it? Does it go away, or is it just olfactory gets it? That you along the line as the time goes, can we see that
Can we see what?
like as you say, in the ancient period, you see the odor, the sense of touch, everything, multisensory property to the how we experience.
Is there a similar aesthetic history that can be done with Islamic sources?
No.
Is that the question?
No. I'm asking whether it become especially the perfume. Does it just the smell only become the one property prominent in that way over the period?
Oh, I know. I see what you mean. Yeah, no. I mean, I wouldn't say it becomes invisible until very modern. Because actually, I think the thing we were talking about with the itter smearings on these miniatures, it just changes because, and I wouldn't say it's a sort of denigration of multisensoriness. I think it's just a technological thing with the itter that you can have.
Yeah, I think there's an equally rich history of synesthesia in that body of material, especially in South Asia. And there are long histories of translations of the continuities of these traditions. I don't see a break, if you're trying to suggest one. There isn't a break. There are additional things that get added on and layered onto the history, but I don't really sense a break in the sources where they stopped a synesthetic approach towards medicine and music, and medicine, music, and fragrance. I think they continue to get developed in the arts and in medical literature, both, or wherever you want to look.
One last thing. This is a more of a sociology of smell.
I think we better
we've
stop
really,
now, but later we'll
and
take
a
any
very
other questions outside.
A very quick thank you to our panelists, and also a really big thank you to the sponsors who sponsor all the Marg publications, books and magazines, because pricing a Marg at say 500 is a major challenge for us at Marg, and we rely on sponsors and philanthropists who are committed to subsidizing each volume to make each Marg, which is a cultural history and which is affordable to readers. And so on the table outside, we've set up some recent issues of Marg. Some of them are at special prices. So please pick up a subscription form. If you're not already a subscriber, subscribe. And finally, we thank our patrons and our sponsors. We thank IIC, our long-term collaborator. We thank Harish and Beena Shah for supporting the Marg Foundation. We thank BNP Paribas, TVS Motors, and the Pirot Shah Godrej Foundation for funding this magazine. And thank you all so much for coming. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Well done. Thank you. Great. Totally went.